"Arrest him now!" The shout rang out from the police officer standing near the front gate, his voice sharp and commanding. Jake felt his heart skip a beat as the words sliced through the tension in the air. For a split second, he wasn't sure if they were talking about him, or if this was all just a terrible mistake. The HOA enforcers had arrived like they did every few months, but this time, something felt different. They were not alone. 2 uniformed police officers had joined them. One of them had his hand resting on his holstered gun, his eyes fixed on Jake like he was a criminal, though he'd done nothing but stand there and try to calm Sarah, who was now visibly shaking in front of the officers. The HOA enforcer who had barked the order, a tall man with a suit too sharp for the small suburban neighborhood, stepped forward with a sneer. "We warned you," he said, his voice dripping with a mix of superiority and satisfaction. "You've ignored our letters, neglected our requests, and now, this is what happens." Jake's mind was racing, and the fury bubbling up inside him was almost impossible to contain. It wasn't just the threat of an arrest that angered him. It was the audacity of it. For months, the HOA had sent ridiculous notices. Grass too high, fence not the right shade. And now they were accusing him of disrupting the peace. It was absurd. "Jake, don't." Sarah's voice trembled as she reached out for him, but it was too late. He could already feel the steam rising inside him. He turned to the officer who had given the order to arrest him. "What the hell is this? Are you really going to arrest me over a complaint from these guys?" The officer didn't even flinch, his eyes stone cold. "We're just here to make sure things go smoothly. You've caused enough trouble with your attitude." Jake felt Sarah's grip tighten on his arm, but there was a fire in him now. He had lived through too much to be pushed around by the petty bureaucracy of an HOA. He had faced real threats, faced down real enemies in his military career, and yet, here he was, on his own property, being threatened with arrest because of a few angry complaints. He glanced at Sarah, her eyes pleading with him to stay calm, but Jake's jaw was clenched tight. "I'm not backing down," he muttered under his breath as he squared up to face the enforcer. The lead enforcer's face twisted into a grin. "You should have complied when we asked. Now it's too late. The law is on our side." Jake wasn't listening anymore. He was thinking of the days he spent overseas, the things he had seen. He had fought for his country, for the freedom of people he didn't even know, and now he was being treated like a criminal in his own home. That wasn't going to stand. "I'm done with you people," Jake growled. "You've crossed the line." He stepped forward, his body language shifting from defensive to confrontational. He was a veteran, trained for situations like this, trained to stand firm even when others tried to intimidate him. His eyes never left the enforcer as he spoke. "You think you can bully us just because you have a little bit of power? Well, not anymore." The lead enforcer's grin faltered, but only for a second. He seemed to reconsider the situation, his eyes narrowing. Behind him, the police officers shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure of how to respond to this sudden escalation. They were supposed to be here to keep the peace, but it was becoming evident that they were on the wrong side of this fight. "Need to calm down," one of the officers said, stepping forward and trying to put a hand on Jake's shoulder. Jake shrugged it off with ease, his eyes locking onto the officer. "I'm calm, but I'm not going to let you push my wife and me around anymore. You have no idea who you're dealing with." There was a beat of silence, thick, heavy. Jake could see the hesitation in the officer's eyes now. It wasn't just the enforcers, who had underestimated him. Even the police officers were starting to wonder if they had made the right call by siding with the HOA. The tension was suffocating, but Jake stood his ground. He knew what was at stake now. They had pushed him to the edge, and if they thought they could intimidate him into submission, they were gravely mistaken. The lead enforcer stepped forward, clearly trying to salvage the situation, but the damage was already done. The HOA had overplayed its hand. "You've made a big mistake, buddy," he sneered, trying to regain control of the situation. But Jake's voice was steady, filled with a quiet authority. "No, You're the ones who made the mistake. You've messed with the wrong people. You want to push us? Go ahead. But you'll find out just how far we'll go to defend what's ours." A flicker of doubt passed across the enforcer's face, but before he could respond, Sarah stepped forward, placing a hand gently on Jake's arm. "Jake, please. This isn't helping." Jake's gaze softened, but his resolve didn't waver. He was doing this for her, for their home, for their peace. But as the tension in the air thickened, Jake knew that this was just the beginning. "This isn't over," Jake muttered to the enforcer, his voice low and resolute. "And you'll see that soon enough." The police officers hesitated. Their eyes darted between the lead enforcer, Jake, and Sarah, who was standing a few steps behind him, her face pale but determined. The tension in the air was palpable. Jake could feel his pulse quicken as he stared down the enforcer who had threatened to arrest him just moments ago. This wasn't just a battle over a lawn or a fence. It was a stand. A line had been drawn, in the sand, and Jake wasn't about to let anyone cross it. The officer who had tried to intervene took a half step back, as if unsure of how to respond. The lead enforcer's gaze flicked to his colleagues, a silent command to take control of the situation. But Jake didn't move. He stood his ground, his body rigid with the quiet power of someone who had faced far worse than this, and survived. "You think this is over?" Jake's voice cut through the silence like a knife. "You've messed with the wrong guy. You want to come to my home, threaten my wife, treat us like criminals for something as petty as a complaint about my yard? No, not happening." The enforcer scoffed, stepping forward once more, his confidence returning. "You don't get to decide what happens here. We've already called for backup. You're making this worse for yourself." Jake's eyes flicked to the police officers again. They were standing there, unsure, torn between their duty to uphold the law and their growing awareness that this situation wasn't as clear-cut as it had seemed. It was becoming obvious to Jake that they were siding with the enforcers because they didn't want to cause trouble. The problem was, the trouble had already been caused and it wasn't going away anytime soon. "I've had enough," Jake muttered under his breath, just loud enough for the officers to hear. He glanced back at Sarah, who was watching him with wide eyes. "Go inside, baby. This isn't something you need to see." Sarah hesitated but then nodded, squeezing his hand before retreating into the house, leaving Jake alone with the enforcers and the officers. The lead enforcer smirked, clearly thinking he had the upper hand. "Now, I don't think we need to escalate things further. You've already made it clear that you don't respect authority, but we can resolve this without you being hauled off in handcuffs. All you have to do is comply." Jake's laugh was low and cold, sending a shiver down the enforcer's spine. "Comply? You think you can just intimidate me into submission? I fought for my country, for people like you, and now you want to tell me how to live my life on my own damn property?" The enforcer's face twitched, but he pressed on. "I'm telling you right now, if you don't back down, we'll be forced to take you in. It'll go on your record. You'll regret this." Jake's gaze hardened. The words cut deeper than the enforcer realized, but Jake wasn't going to show it. Instead, he stepped forward, getting in the enforcer's face, his voice low and filled with an unshakable resolve. "You really think I'm scared of a record? I've fought battles that were far worse than this, against enemies who would have torn me apart if I let them. But you know what? I'm not scared of you. You're nothing but a bully with a clipboard." The lead enforcer stiffened, but before he could respond, one of the officers spoke up, trying to diffuse the tension. "This is getting out of hand, guys," the officer said, his voice more uncertain now. "We don't need to escalate things. Why don't we just take a step back and figure this out before things get worse?" Jake locked eyes with the officer, reading the doubt in his expression. For a moment it felt like they were on the same side, both of them stuck in a situation where they didn't know how it would end. But Jake wasn't going to wait around to find out. He needed to act, and he needed to act now. "You're right," Jake said, his voice suddenly calm but laced with steel. "This is getting out of hand, so let's make it simple. You're going to walk off my property and you're going to leave my family alone. If you don't, I'm not the one who's going to regret it," the enforcer sneered. You're not in a position to make demands. Jake didn't flinch. Oh, I'm in exactly the position I need to be. You're not the ones who have the power here anymore. We do. So take your threats and your demands and get out. The tension in the air thickened, hanging like a storm cloud, ready to burst. For a moment it seemed like the enforcers would push back, but the officer who had been quiet until now stepped forward again. I think it's time to call it, the officer said. We're done here. I don't want this to escalate. The lead enforcer's face twisted with frustration, but he knew there was little he could do now. He looked at the officer and then back at Jake, as if considering whether to press forward. But something in Jake's unwavering stance told him it wasn't worth the fight. With a muttered curse, the enforcer turned and began walking back to his truck, signaling the others to follow. The police officers stood there for a moment, as if unsure how to proceed, but eventually they too turned, walking away with a sense of defeat that hadn't been there when they first arrived. Jake stood motionless on the porch, watching them leave. His chest was tight, his hands trembling slightly from the adrenaline, but he wasn't about to let his guard down. Not yet. Sarah stepped out onto the porch again, looking over her shoulder to make sure the enforcers were really gone. When she saw Jake standing there, still staring at the retreating figures, she let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. "You did it," she whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and awe. Jake didn't answer immediately. He was still processing what had just happened, the way he had stood up to them, the way they had backed down. It felt like a small victory, but deep down, he knew this wasn't over. The HOA wasn't going to let this go, and the enforcers would be back, more determined than ever. But for now, at least, they had won. Jake sat on the porch, the weight of the last few hours settling heavily on his shoulders. The adrenaline that had once surged through him now felt like a dull throb in his chest, an uneasy calm after the storm. He had fought, stood up for what was his, but something gnawed at him. Something told him this wasn't the end. The HOA had been humiliated today, but they weren't the type to let something like this slide. He glanced over at Sarah, who was now sitting beside him, her hand resting gently on his. She hadn't said much since the enforcers left, but the look in her eyes said everything. She was proud of him, but worried too, worried about what might come next. "You know they won't just forget this, right?" Sarah asked, her voice soft but carrying a weight of truth. She hadn't asked him to get involved, hadn't wanted him to get into a fight with the HOA, but she knew him well enough by now. Jake didn't back down. Ever. Jake nodded, his eyes scanning the road as he thought about what was next. "I know. But we're not going to let them walk all over us. Not again." Suddenly, the sharp sound of a car engine broke the silence. Jake's head snapped toward the street, his heart skipping a beat. A black SUV rolled up slowly, its tinted windows, making it impossible to see who was inside. It wasn't the police and it wasn't any of the HOA enforcers, but it was a warning. Jake felt a cold wave wash over him as the vehicle came to a stop at the edge of the driveway. Before he could say anything, the door of the SUV opened, and out stepped a man wearing an expensive suit, sunglasses, even though the sun was setting. He walked toward them with a purposeful stride, his hands clasped behind his back. Jake could tell immediately that this wasn't someone who normally handled small neighborhood disputes. This was someone with power, someone who didn't want to be challenged. Sarah tensed beside him and Jake stood up slowly, his instincts kicking into gear. "Can I help you?" Jake asked, his voice calm but with an edge that came from years of facing high-pressure situations. The man in the suit stopped just a few feet away, his eyes scanning the front yard before he focused on Jake. "I'm Robert Langford," he said coolly, not bothering with any pleasantries. "I'm the president of the HOA board." Jake didn't flinch. "I'm guessing you're here about what happened earlier." Langford smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "I'm here because I think it's time we talked. It seems you've made quite an impression today, and that's not exactly how we handle things in this community." Jake felt the tension in his chest tighten. This man wasn't here to negotiate, he was here to intimidate, and Jake wasn't going to let that happen. "You're right," Jake replied, his voice firm. "I made an impression. You and your enforcers came here, made threats, and tried to push my family around. You'll have to do a lot more than talk to make me back down." Langford's smile faded, and for a brief moment Jake saw something flash in his eyes, something dangerous. "You're making a big mistake, Mr. Roberts. You don't want to make this personal. I have a lot of influence, and I don't think you realize the kind of trouble you've just brought upon yourself." Jake stood his ground. "Maybe you don't realize how far I'm willing to go to protect my family. I'm not scared of your threats, Langford. I've been through worse, and I'll stand here and fight you all the way if that's what it takes. We'll see who regrets this in the end." Langford's eyes narrowed, and he took a step closer. "You'll learn soon enough that you can't win a fight like this. We have the resources, the power, everything you don't. You'll be ostracized. You'll lose, and when you do, it'll be your fault, not mine." Jake's jaw clenched, his hands at his sides, fists now tight with the anger boiling inside him. But then, just as quickly as it came, a thought broke through the haze of frustration. It was a moment of clarity, a realization that Langford's power came from the same place as his threats. Fear. Fear of what might happen if someone stood up to him. Fear of losing control. Fear that the system they had built, the system of power and intimidation, could be torn down by one person who wasn't afraid to stand up for what was right. "Here's the thing, Langford," Jake said, his voice low and steady. "You might have the power now. You might think you can intimidate people. But at the end of the day, you're just a man. You're not invincible. And the sooner you realize that, the better." Langford's face twisted in rage, but just as quickly he masked it with a thin veneer of control. "You've made your choice, Roberts. But don't say I didn't warn you. This won't end well for you." Without another word, Langford turned and walked back to his SUV, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. The car door slammed shut, and the vehicle sped off down the road, leaving only a trail of dust in its wake. Jake didn't move. He stood there, watching the car disappear into the distance, but his mind was already turning, calculating. He knew Langford wasn't done, but Jake had one thing the HOA didn't. He had nothing left to lose. Sarah stood up next to him, her hand reaching for his again. This time there was no fear in her eyes, there was only pride. "You did the right thing, Jake," she said softly. Jake squeezed her hand, a tired but resolute smile tugging at his lips. "This isn't over, but we're not backing down. Not ever." And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jake knew one thing for sure. The battle had only just begun.